Article 20 deals with the protection in respect of conviction for offences. Article 20 Clause 1 deals with protection against ex post facto laws. The term ex post facto law literally means arising from past facts, but in its technical sense refers to a class of laws that retrospectively inflict harm on persons on account of past lawful conduct. Professor M.P. Jain in his book wrote that an ex post facto law is a law which imposes penalties retrospectively, that is, upon acts already done, or which increases the penalty for the past acts. Article 20, Clause 1 guarantees protection against ex post facto law. The moral objection to ex post facto law is founded on the rule of law that a person is subjected only to established and known law. To understand Article 20, Clause 1 easily, we need to read the provision by dividing it into two parts. Article 20, Clause 1 states, no person shall be convicted to any offence except, first part is as follows, for violation of the law in force at the time of the commission of the act charged as an offence. Second, nor be subjected to a penalty greater than that which might have been inflicted under the law in force at the time of the commission of the offence. There is a maxim, nullum crimen nulla poena sine lege, which means no crime without a breach of the law. If a crime is understood to be an act that is prohibited by law at the pain of a penalty, an act which is not so prohibited can never be a crime. This principle condemns the retrospective increase in penalties. According to the maxim, a retrospective increase of punishment or penalty is an infliction of new pain not prescribed by law. The words used in Article 20, Clause 1, such as convicted, commission of the act charged as an offence, be subjected to a penalty, commission of offence, would indicate that Article 20, Clause 1 is applicable only to the criminal proceedings before a court of law or a judicial tribunal. The prosecution in this context would mean an initiation or starting of proceedings of a criminal nature before a court of law or judicial tribunal in accordance with the procedure prescribed in the statute which creates the offence and regulates the procedure. Article 20 provides protection in respect of conviction of offences. Now coming to the international scenario, Article 15, Clause 1 of the United Nations Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, condemns laws that hold a person guilty of any criminal offence on account of any act or omission which did not constitute a criminal offence at the time when it was committed, or impose a heavier penalty than the one that was applicable at the time when a criminal offence was committed. Further, Article 7, Clause 1 of the European Convention on Human Rights, ECHR, makes the prohibition applicable to acts and omissions which did not constitute a criminal offence under national or international law at the time when it was committed. The prohibition is part of the UK law under Human Rights Act 1998. Now coming to the interpretation clause. First of all, we need to understand the technical terms used in the provision. The word person used in each clause, the article must be regarded as applicable to a corporation which is accused, prosecuted, convicted, or punished for an offence. The protection contained in Article 20 is available to all persons, citizens or non-citizens. Now coming to the interpretation of the word offence, Article 367 of the Indian Constitution, read with Section 3, Clause 28 of the General Clauses Act 1977, defines offence as any act or omission made up punishable by any law for the time being in force. This definition acts as a limitation upon legislation not to legislate a criminal law providing for offences with retrospective effect. Further, the meaning of penalty here is a payment which has to be made or a deprivation of liberty which has to be suffered as a consequence of finding that the person accused of a crime is guilty of the offence. The important points which one should keep in mind while applying Article 20 Clause 1 is Article 20 Clause 1 restricts only the conviction for an offence or imposition of penalty retrospectively. Article 20 Clause 1 does not bar a civil liability being imposed retrospectively. According to Professor D.D. Basu, the prohibition in Article 20 Clause 1 is only against prescribing judicial punishment with retrospective effect. It does not prohibit the enforcement of any other sanction by a civil or revenue authority. For example, the loss of deprivation of any business or forfeiture of property or cancellation of naturalization certificate by reason of an act committed prior to the operation of the penal law in question, or the imposition of some statutory penalty to enforce a civil liability. All these examples come under the purview of the civil sanction. Such civil sanctions are not covered under Article 20 Clause 1. Article 20 Clause 1 does not prohibit the trial of offences under the ex post facto laws. Hence, a law enacted subsequent to the commission of the offence prescribing a new procedure different from the ordinary procedure for prosecution or trial is not hit by Article 20 Clause 1. What is prohibited under Article 20 Clause 1 is only conviction or sentence under an ex post facto law and not the trial. The trial conducted before the commencement of the act, which is in totality different from the later act, cannot be declared ipso facto unconstitutional under Article 20 Clause 1. The change of the place of trial does not affect Article 20 Clause 1. One more important point, that is Article 20 Clause 1 has no application in case of preventive detention and disciplinary proceedings. The trial here shall be judicial proceeding. Now coming to the three categories which may fall under ex post facto laws are a law which declares some act or omission as an offence for the first time after the completion of that act or omission. Second, a law which enhances the punishment or penalty for an offence subsequent to the commission of that offence. Third, a law which prescribes a new and different procedure for the prosecution of an offence subsequent to the commission of that offence. These are the three broad categories into which an ex post facto law can be placed. Now, Article 20 Clause 1 provides protection only against the first and the second type or category. Article 20 Clause 1 first part relates to the first category of ex post facto law, that is a law which declares some act or omission as an offence for the first time after the completion of that act or omission. Now coming to the verbatim of Article 20 Clause 1, no person shall be convicted to any offence except for the violation of a law in force at the time of the commission of the act charged as an offence. In India, there can be no common law offences, and the judiciary cannot in India create an offence not created by statute. Hence, here offences has to be created by the law only. The expression law in force refers to the law factually in operation at the time when the offence was committed and does not relate to the law deemed to be in force but the retrospective operation of law subsequently made. The law for the violation of which a person is sought to be convicted must have been in fact in force at the time when the act with which he is charged was committed. But rules and regulations made under a statute which is repealed but continued in force under Section 24 of the General Clauses Act are considered as law in force within the meaning of Article 20 Clause 1, even though they are kept alive by a legal fiction. Article 372 Clause 3 Explanation 1 shows that a law in force means an enacted law, even if it or parts of it are not in operation either at all or in particular areas. With this, it is clear that such a law is not a law in force within the meaning of Article 20. If the law is not in operation, it cannot constitute an act, a crime during the time it is not in force. In Soni Devraj Bhai Babu Bhai versus State of Gujarat, it was discussed that Section 304B of IPC, inserted in the Indian Penal Code on November 19, 1986, created a distinct offence of dowry death and providing a minimum sentence of 7 years imprisonment could not be applied to such death caused before the insertion of the section because of the prohibition contained in Article 20 Clause 1. So here you can see that a distinct offence has been created, that is dowry death with a minimum 7 years of sentence was created on November 19, 1986. So any such offence if occurred before November 19, 1986 cannot be called as an offence and a person cannot be convicted for committing such offences before that particular date. Further, we all saw a lot of agitation to punish the juvenile involved in the Nirbhaya gang rape case under JJ Act, which was enacted after the commission of the offence. But the agitation literally is against the rule of law and Article 20 Clause 1, as there is a guarantee against ex post facto law that minor was not punished in accordance with the JJ Act 2015 and he has been considered as a juvenile, not as an adult. Further, in Om Prakash versus State of UP, it was held that accused could not be punished under Section 165A of the IPC for offering bribe in 1948, as Section 3 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act 1952 inserted Section 165A of the Indian Penal Code, declaring offer of bribe as punishable offence. So, if a person is convicted under an offence which has been given a retrospective effect, automatically Article 20 Clause 1 will come into his rescue. Now coming to the case laws. In Sajjan Singh versus State of Punjab, the application of Section 5 Clause 3 of the Prevention of Corruption Act was challenged in the Supreme Court for being in violation of Article 20 Clause 1. Section 5 Clause 3 of the Prevention of Corruption Act has been created in order to punish corrupt government officers. It created the offence of criminal misconduct. It creates a presumption to the effect that if the government servant for corruption has in his possession property or assets which was wholly disproportionate to his known sources of income, and if he cannot explain these same satisfactorily, then he is guilty of criminal misconduct. Sajjan Singh raised the argument that Section 5 Clause 3 talks about the property which was raised or acquired after the act came into force. Hence, according to him, the property which was raised or acquired before the birth of the legislation should not be seized or appropriated by the government. Only the property which was acquired after the date of the act is to be considered under Section 5 Clause 3 of the Prevention of Corruption Act. The Supreme Court rejected this contention of the petitioner and held that a statute cannot be said to be retrospective because a part of the requisites for its actions is drawn from a time antecedent to its passing. Section 5 Clause 1 of the Prevention of Corruption Act prescribes the offence of criminal misconduct for which an accused person is already under trial for the acts committed after the act came into force. The code in this case held that it merely prescribes a rule of evidence for the purpose of proving the offence of criminal misconduct as defined in Section 5 Clause 1 of the Prevention of Corruption Act, for which an accused person is already under trial. When there is such a trial, which necessarily must be in respect of acts committed after the Prevention of Corruption Act came into force, Section 5, Clause 3 places in the hands of the prosecution a new mode of proving an offence with which an accused has already been charged. A person can be convicted and punished under a law in force, which means a law factually in existence at the time the offence was committed. A law passed on 31st March 2020 but given an operation from 31st August 2019 cannot be taken to be a law in force on 31st August 2019. Hence, an act committed on 31st August 2019 cannot be considered as an offence under a law which is passed on 31st March 2020. The factual date of commencement of the law in the given example is 31st March 2020, right? So, even by deeming provision, one cannot give a retrospective effect to the penal legislations and punish a person for an offence which was committed before legislation of a particular law. Such retrospective application of such penal law would attract Article 20 Clause 1 despite of the fact that there is a deeming provision which gives a retrospectivity to that penal legislation. Under Article 20 Clause 1, application of such deeming effect to criminal legislations giving retrospective operation is prohibited. In America, ex post facto law is in itself invalid. In India, courts have discretion to give retrospective effect to an act. So here, Article 20 Clause 1 to be interpreted by the courts whether to give a retrospective effect to a criminal legislation or not to give. That means whether giving a retrospective effect to a criminal legislation violates Article 20 Clause 1 or not is to be decided by the judiciary. That means technically courts have discretion to give retrospective effect to an act. Now coming to the next case, Sakshi versus Union of India. In this case, the main issue was to declare that sexual intercourse as contained in section 375 of the IPC shall include all forms of penetration. The petitioner through the present petition contended that the narrow interpretation and application of the rape under section 375 or 376 of IPC only to the cases of penetration runs contrary to the existing contemporary understanding of rape as an intent to humiliate, violate, and degrade a woman or child sexually and therefore adversely affects the sexual integrity and autonomy of the women and children in violation of Article 21 of the Constitution. In this case, while dealing with this issue, the court held that such broader interpretation violates Article 20 Clause 1. That means the court said at the time of the commission of the offence, the person has an understanding of section 375 of an IPC in one direction. Now giving a broader interpretation means it should have a prospective application rather than retrospective application. If we give a retrospective application to the judgment which gives a broader interpretation to section 375 or 376 of IPC, that would amount to Article 20 Clause 1 violation. That's what court was considering, rejecting to give a broader interpretation to this particular case while dealing with section 375 or 376 of IPC. Now coming to the second part of Article 20 Clause 1. Article 20 Clause 1 provides that no person shall be convicted of an offence, of any offence, not to be subjected to a penalty greater than that which might have been inflicted under the law in force at the time of the commission of the offence. That means Article 20 Clause 1 immunizes a person from a penalty greater than what he might have incurred at the time of his committing the offence. Take the case K. Satwant Singh versus State of Punjab. According to section 420 of IPC, no minimum sentence of fine has been provided and under it an unlimited fine can be imposed. Section 420 is as follows: cheating and dishonestly inducing delivery of property. Whoever cheats and thereby dishonestly induces the person deceived any property to any person, or to make, alter, or destroy the whole or any part of the valuable security, or anything which is signed or sealed and which is capable of being converted into a valuable security, shall be punished with imprisonment of either description for a term which may be extended to 7 years, and shall also be liable to fine. So here, you can see here that the words in the red color deals with the fine, and there is no limitation upon the amount of fine which can be imposed. Now coming to the facts, Mr. Satwant Singh committed an offence punishable under section 420 of IPC in the year 1942. Later in the year 1942, an ordinance was brought into force which laid down the minimum fine which a court must compulsorily inflict on a person convicted under section 420 of IPC. When the same was applied on Mr. Satwant Singh, he approached the court for violation of Article 20 Clause 1. Supreme Court in this case held that Section Article 20 Clause 1 was not infringed by the trial of Satwant Singh under the ordinance, because the minimum penalty prescribed by it could not be said to be greater than what could be inflicted on Satwant Singh under Section 420 IPC in force at the time he committed the offence, because 420 do not prescribe any maximum or minimum penalty. So under 420 an unlimited fine can be imposed. Hence the court, again I am repeating, here held that if Satwant Singh was punished under the ordinance with a minimum penalty prescribed by it, it cannot be proved to be greater than what could be inflicted on Satwant Singh under section 420 of IPC, which was already in force at the time he committed the offence. Hence, here court denied to apply Article 20 Clause 1. What Article 20 Clause 1 says is, it immunizes a person from a penalty greater than what he might have incurred at the time of the commission of the offence. I am again repeating, here you can see there is no minimum or maximum fine which was prescribed under section 420. If the ordinance prescribes a minimum penalty, such minimum penalty can always be interpreted to be a lesser than what could have been inflicted upon Satwant Singh under section 420 IPC. That's how the court in this case held that Article 20 Clause 1 cannot be applied. Now coming to the next case, Kedarnath versus State of West Bengal. The accused managing agent of a company committed an offence in 1947. Subsequently, the Criminal Law Special Courts Amendment Act 1949 amended the said act. The amended law enhanced the penalty for the offences committed under the act by an additional fine to be equivalent to the amount of money found to have been procured by the offender through the offence. It was held that penalty enhanced by amended law, which came into force in 1949, could not be imposed on the accused for the offence committed in 1947 because of the prohibition contained in the second part of the Article 20 Clause 1. So here again I am repeating, you can see here that amended law enhanced the penalty for the offence committed under the act by an additional fine to be equivalent to the amount of money found to have been procured by the offender through the offence. The court in this case held that such application of enhanced penalty to a person who committed the offence before such enhancement by the law will amount to violation of Article 20 Clause 1. Right? Now coming to State of West Bengal versus S.K. Ghosh. In this case, the accused, a government servant, was placed under suspension for commission of embezzlement before August 1944. Subsequently, on August 23rd, 1944, an ordinance was issued providing for confiscation of the property of a person convicted for embezzlement of government money to set off the embezzled money. Therefore, the property of the accused was forfeited under the ordinance. This was challenged under Article 20 clause. The ordinance was held valid as it did not impose a penalty but merely provided a speedier remedy for the recovery of the embezzled money. Hence, the court in this case held that such speedier remedy is not attracted under Article 20 clause 1. Further, in this case, the court reiterated that Article 20 clause 1 deals only with criminal offences, not to civil wrongs. Here you can clearly see that a person was convicted for embezzlement of government money, and he had to set off the embezzled money. So for that purpose, his property has to be confiscated. The property which has been acquired even before the enforcement of the legislation can be confiscated for setting off the embezzled government money. So such is nothing but a remedy which is provided to the loss suffered by the government. That is not a penalty. Penalty is already inflicted, that he committed a crime, he had to return back the embezzled money. That is the penalty. In what method and manner you would be setting off the embezzled money is only a recovery process. Recovery process is not covered under Article 20 clause 1. Now coming to the Ratan Lal versus State of Punjab. In this case, the accused, a boy of 16 years, was convicted for the offence of house trespass and outraging the modesty of a girl aged 7 years. The magistrate sentenced the boy for rigorous imprisonment for 6 months and also the fine. While the accused was undergoing imprisonment, the Probation of Offenders Act 1958 came in force, which provided that a person below the age of 21 years should not ordinarily be sentenced to imprisonment. Accused claimed benefits under the Act as part of reformation measure. The state contended that Act in question, being ex post facto, could not be pleaded by the accused. The Supreme Court in this case held that ex post facto law, which was beneficial to the accused, did not fall within the prohibition of Article 20 clause 1. If you go back to the provision, you can see here Article 20 clause 1 prohibits imposing a penalty greater than what he might have incurred. If the penalty is less than what he might have incurred, it is the discretion of the court whether to consider the lesser penalty or not. So Article 20 clause 1 protects only the imposition of greater penalty, not the lesser penalty which is beneficial to the candidate. So in Ratan Lal case, the court held that rule of beneficial construction required that ex post facto law could be applied to reduce the punishment. So ex post facto law can be applied to reduce the punishment but not to increase the punishment. If you are increasing, it is against to Article 20 clause 1. In this case, the court held that every ex post facto law is necessarily retrospective, but what is prohibited is only those ex post facto laws which imposes a higher penalty or punishes a person for an offence which was not an offence at the time of the commission of the act. That's how Article 20 clause 1 to be interpreted and applied. Now coming to the prospective application of judicial decisions vis-a-vis Article 20 clause 1. In Sarla Mudgal versus Union of India, it was held that the second marriage of a Hindu husband after conversion to Islam without having his first marriage dissolved according to law would be invalid and the husband would be guilty of the offence under Section 494 of IPC. Subsequently, in Lily Thomas versus Union of India, Supreme Court, while rejecting the contention of giving retrospective effect to the judicial ruling given in Sarla Mudgal, held that such retrospective application will violate Article 20 Clause 1. According to the Apex Court, it ought to be given only prospective operation so that the ruling could not be applied to a person who had already solemnized the second marriage prior to the date of Sarla case. Prior to this, I already explained in Sakshi versus Union of India that the court denied to give a broader interpretation to section 375 or 376 of IPC, the interpretation of the word rape, to the facts of Sakshi versus Union of India by holding that such application of broader interpretation to Sakshi versus Union of India will amount to retrospective application of the judicial decision. They said hereafter, whichever the case which comes before the court dealing with the rape cases, there they can give such a broader interpretation to our section 375 or 376 and punish such person by showing the judgment of Sakshi versus Union of India. But applying a broader interpretation all of a sudden to the facts which are already in hands will amount to retrospective imposition of the judicial decision, which will fall under Article 20 Clause 1. That means such retrospective application of the judicial proceedings dealing with the criminal legislations would attract Article 20 Clause 1. Now, further, the court in Lily Thomas versus Union of India said that it did not lay down any new law in Sarla Mudgal and it only interpreted the law which had already been in existence. Hence, the effectiveness can be given only from the date of the law, but not from the date of judgment. The court, while expressing its limitation, held that the court can only interpret but cannot legislate. Article 20 Clause 1 requires the legislation to be retrospective effect, but still court opined that judgments are also bound to be within the purview of Article 20 Clause 1. With this, we will conclude Article 20 Clause 1. Now coming to Article 20 Clause 2, guarantee against double jeopardy. Article 20 Clause 2 of the Constitution provides that no person shall be prosecuted and punished for the same offence more than once. It incorporates a prohibition against double jeopardy. This clause enacts the well-known principle of criminal jurisprudence that no one should be put in jeopardy twice for the same offence. This principle is based on common law maxim nemo debet bis vexari, which means that a person must not be put in peril twice for the same offence. In Venkataraman versus Union of India case, it was held that Article 20 Clause 2 refers to judicial punishment and gives immunity to a person from being prosecuted and punished for the same offence more than once. To put it in a simple sense, if a person has been prosecuted and punished in a previous proceeding of an offence, he cannot be prosecuted and punished for the same offence again in a subsequent proceedings. If any law provides for such double punishment, such law would be void under Article 20 Clause 2. In Britain and United States of America, both the rules operate and a second trial is barred even when the accused has been acquitted at the first trial for that offence. That means here in Britain and USA, in the first trial where a person has been prosecuted and acquitted, then also holding a second trial for the same offence is constitutionally barred. The Fifth Amendment of the United States of American Constitution provides, nor shall any person be subject for the same offence to be put twice in jeopardy of life or limb. In US, the protection is not only against a second punishment but even against the peril in which a person is placed by the second trial for the same offence. In India, we have only atraphois convict, but not atraphois acquit. And atraphois convict means here in the first offense, the person would have been prosecuted and convicted, then conducting a second prosecution against the same offense and convicting him would amount to double jeopardy. Whereas in terms of the atraphois acquit, in the first trial the person would have been prosecuted, might have been convicted, or might have been acquitted. Still, holding a second prosecution and acquitting or punishing both. See, there is no requirement of even acquitting or punishing in the second prosecution. Even if prosecution is initiated for the same offense, then that would amount to violation of the principle atraphois acquit. Fine, it amounts to double jeopardy. So in India, we have only atraphois convict because in Article 20 Clause 2 it says a person should not have been prosecuted and punished for the same offense twice, right? Now coming to the interpretation of Article 20 Clause 2. Article 20 Clause 2 may be invoked only when there has been prosecution and punishment in the first instance. If a person has been prosecuted for an offense but acquitted, he cannot claim protection under Article 20 Clause 2. The article, however, does not give immunity from proceedings other than the proceedings before a court of law or a judicial tribunal. Hence, a government servant who has been punished for an offense in court of law may yet be subjected to departmental proceedings for the same offense again. That would not amount to Article 20 Clause 2 because departmental proceedings are not considered as a judicial proceedings. Where a person has been convicted for an offense by a competent court, the conviction is a bar to any further criminal proceedings against him for the same offense. Now coming to the word same offense, to invoke Article 20 Clause 2, the person must have been prosecuted and punished for the same offense which involves the same ingredients in all respect, and a trial for a separate and distinct offense is not barred under Article 20 Clause 2. So here same offense is to be stressed upon. That means in the first trial and in the second trial, the ingredients of the offense shall be same. What are ingredients of offense? Take for example theft. Take for example dacoity. The ingredients of the offense dacoity are different from the ingredients of the offense theft. If a person has been convicted and punished for theft in the first trial, and in the subsequent trial he has been tried for dacoity, then that would not amount to same offense. Hence, he cannot seek protection under Article 20 Clause 2. When a trial has some reason become abortive, either because of some inherent defect or illegality affecting the validity of the trial itself, a second trial is not barred by Article 20 Clause 2. Further, an enhancement of punishment by the revising authority does not amount to second punishment. The double jeopardy rule is applicable only in case of same offense. If the same act is falling under two different offenses, then the punishment of one offense does not bar prosecution and punishment for the other offense. Now coming to section 300 CRPC vis-a-vis Article 20 Clause 2. Section 301 of CRPC provides that a person who has once been tried by a court of competent jurisdiction for an offense and convicted or acquitted of such offense shall, while such conviction or acquittal remains in force, not be liable to be tried again for the same offense, nor on the same facts for any other offense for which a different charge from the one made against him might have been made under section 221 subsection 1, or for which he might have been convicted under section 222 subsection 2 thereof. Further, section 26 of the General Clauses Act provides that where an act or omission constitutes an offense under two or more enactments, then offender shall be liable to be prosecuted and punished either or any of the enactments, but shall not be liable to be punished twice for the same offense. In Bhagwan Swaroop Lal Bishan Lal versus State of Maharashtra, court, while referring to section 300 of the CRPC, held that section 300 of the CRPC provides that a person once convicted or acquitted is not to be tried for same offense. That means section 300 of CRPC incorporates both atrofiois acquit as well as atrofiois convict. A person acquitted or convicted of any offense constituted by any acts may, notwithstanding such acquittal or conviction, be subsequently charged with and tried for any other offense constituted by some acts which he may have committed, if the court by which he was first tried was not competent to try the offense with which he is subsequently charged. So first condition is he should not be charged under the same offense. Second condition is the first one and the second one both shall be the judicial proceedings. And the third condition is the trial should have been conducted by a competent authority. So that's how this section lays down that a person once convicted or acquitted cannot be tried for the same offense if both the trials are judicial proceedings and both the trials must have been conducted by the competent authority. In order to bar the trial of any person already tried, it must be shown that he has been tried by a competent court for the same offense of one for which he might have been charged or convicted at the trial on the same facts that he has been convicted or acquitted at the trial, and that such conviction or acquittal is in force. A trial by a court not having jurisdiction is void ab initio, and the accused, if acquitted, is liable to be retried. Now coming to the case, State of Bombay versus S.L. Apte. Facts of the case are as follows. A person was convicted under section 409 IPC for criminal breach of trust. He was prosecuted later under section 105 of the Insurance Act because the act done by that person was falling under that provision also. He claimed the protection against double jeopardy under Article 20 Clause 2. Here you can see that under 409 of IPC, he has been convicted for the crime offense criminal breach of trust. Whereas under section 105 of the Insurance Act, he has been convicted for separate offense. The ingredients of both the offenses seems to be different. Hence, he claimed protection against double jeopardy under Article 20 Clause 2. The Constitution Bench of in this case held that while dealing with the issue of double jeopardy under Article 20 Clause 2, there must be same offense. The crucial requirement, therefore, for attracting the article is that the offense are the same. That is, they should be identical. If, however, the two offenses are distinct, then notwithstanding that the allegations of fact in the two complaints might be substantially similar, the benefit of the ban cannot be invoked. It is therefore to analyze and compare not the allegations in the two complaints, but the ingredients of the two offenses and see whether their identity is made out or not. The next point considered in this case is the scope of section 26 of the General Clauses Act. Though section 26 of the General Clauses Act in its opening words refers to the act or commission constituting an offense under two or more enactments, the emphasis is not on the facts alleged in the two complaints, but rather on the ingredients which constitute the two offenses with which a person is charged. This is made clear by the concluding portion of the section, which refers to shall not be liable to be punished twice for the same offense. If the offenses are not the same but are distinct, the ban imposed by this provision also cannot be invoked. Now coming to the next case in Maqbool Hussain versus State of Bombay. The facts of the case are as follows. Indian citizen brought some gold without making a declaration from a foreign country. The customs authorities took action against him under sections 167 of the Sea Customs Act 1898 and confiscated the gold. Later on, he was charged under section 8 of the FERA 1947, that is Foreign Exchange Regulation Act. Petitioner claimed protection under Article 20, Clause 2. The court held that the sea customs authorities were not a court or a judicial tribunal. As I already explained to you, that both the offences should have been tried in a competent judicial proceedings, that is a competent court, before a competent court in the judicial proceedings. Here, since the sea customs authorities are not a court or a judicial tribunal, and the adjudication of confiscation under the Sea Customs Act did not constitute a judgment or as an order of a court or a judicial tribunal, the petitioner cannot get protection under 20 Clause 2. The proceedings taken before the Sea Customs authorities, therefore, did not amount to prosecution of petitioner, nor the order of confiscation constitute a punishment imposed by a court. Hence, the court held that the prosecution instituted against Maqbool Hussain under the Foreign Exchange Regulations Act 1947 is the first prosecution, and first prosecution is not prohibited under Article 20 Clause 2. Now coming to the Leo Roy Frey versus Superintendent District Jail, AR 1958 SC 119. The proceedings before the customs authorities were under section 167 clause 8 of the Sea Customs Act, where the petitioner's contraband was confiscated. A subsequent criminal prosecution for the charge of criminal conspiracy under section 120B of the IPC on the same facts were held not to be violative of Article 20 clause 2. In this case, the court held that offences of conspiracy to commit a crime is a different offence from the crime that is the object of the conspiracy, because conspiracy precedes the commission of the crime. Hence, once the conspiracy completes, then the offence is committed. So, conspiracy first comes, it is completed, then the offence comes. So, both are two different elements, and their ingredients are also different. Hence, they both constitute two separate offences. Conspiracy under section 120B of the IPC as well as section 167 clause 8 of the Sea Customs Act, both are totally different offences. Hence, Article 20 clause 2 cannot be applied. Now coming to the interpretation of the word prosecution. For the purpose of Article 20 Clause 2, the former prosecution must be criminal in nature. As I already explained that it has to be a criminal prosecution. Must be, and such prosecution must be before a court of law or a judicial tribunal, required by law to decide matters in controversy judicially on evidence and on oath, which must be authorized by law to administer. Such proceedings should not be before a tribunal which entertains a departmental or administrative inquiry, even though set up by a statute, but not required to proceed on legal evidence given on oath. So these are the important interpretations which have been laid down in different cases by the courts while dealing with the interpretation of the expression prosecution under Article 20 Clause 2. Now coming to S.A. Venkatraman versus Union of India. The facts of the case are as follows. The appellant, a government servant, has charged with committing corruption. An inquiry was held against him under Public Servants in 1850. As a result of report of the inquiries commission, he was dismissed from the service. Subsequently, charges were levied against him under sections 161 and 165 of IPC as well as sections 5 clause 2 of the Prevention of Corruption Act. As Mr. Venkatraman challenged the criminal proceedings laid down against him, charged against him under the IPC as well as Prevention of Corruption Act by stating that he has been already prosecuted under the Public Servants Inquiries Act and he has been already dismissed as part of punishment. and subsequent trial under IPC as well as Prevention of Corruption Act is amounting to double jeopardy. Hence, his case is protected under Article 20 Clause 2. The court, while dealing with this case, held that the inquiry conducted under the Public Servants Inquiry Act is the proceedings taken before the inquiry commissioner, not before a court. Such proceedings cannot be considered as judicial proceedings. It was in the nature of a fact-finding inquiry held to advise the government for taking any disciplinary action against Mr. Venkataraman. Therefore, the prosecution under IPC as well as the Prevention of Corruption Act is the first, is not barred under Article 20 Clause 2. Again, I am repeating, departmental inquiry is not considered to be a prosecution, and the award of such proceedings is not the punishment. It's not the decision of the court, first point, and it does not amount to punishment. Hence, such departmental inquiries are not barred under 20 Clause 2. Now coming to the next case, Kalavati versus State of HP. The appellant charged for committing murder of her husband and was prosecuted but acquitted by the district judge. The state preferred an appeal against acquittal in High Court. The accused contended that proceedings before the High Court contravened Article 20 Clause 2. The court held that appeal against the acquittal was not second prosecution but continuation of the original prosecution. Therefore, Article 20 Clause 2 would not be attracted. Besides, in the earlier prosecution, she was acquitted, right? So, there is no punishment. Hence, atrofes convict is to be applied under section Article 20 Clause 2, not the atrofes acquit. Further, even by considering that both the proceedings are parallel proceedings, parallel judicial proceedings, but whereas it is an appeal, so the court held that it's a continuation, not a separate proceedings. Now coming to the plea of double jeopardy. The plea of double jeopardy may be distinguished from the rule of issue estoppel. The rule of issue estoppel precludes evidence being led to prove a fact in issue as regards which evidence has already been led and a specific finding recorded at an earlier criminal trial before a competent court. The rule related only to the admissibility of the evidence. While Article 20 Clause 2 bars double punishment, the rule of issue estoppel finding was in favor of the accused of a previous trial. Article 20 Clause 2 has no direct bearing on the question at issue, while the rule of issue estoppel relates to evidence on the question in issue at the two trials. What is required for the application of the rule of estoppel is the identity of issue and the acquittal of the accused at a previous trial on the same issue, while Article 20 Clause 2 would be attracted if the punishment is the same in the second prosecution for which the accused has earlier been prosecuted and punished. That is the difference between the plea of double jeopardy as well as the rule of issue estoppel, right? That is in Kolla Veera Raghavarao versus Gorantla Venkateshwar Rao, 2011 to SCC 703. The issue which has been dealt in this case is whether a person can be prosecuted under the same facts but for a different offence under a different statute. While dealing with the difference between Article 20 Clause 2 of the Indian Constitution and Section 301 of the IPC, the court held that Section 301 of CRPC, Section 301 of CRPC, the court held that Section 301 of CRPC is wider in scope than Article 20 Clause 2 of the Indian Constitution. Why? Because Section 301 of CRPC is dealing with atrofes acquit, whereas Article 20 Clause 2 deals with atrofes convict only. Now coming to the case Monica Bedi versus State of AP. It's one of the famous case. Monica Bedi is a famous film actor in South India. Monica Bedi obtained a second passport in the assumed name of Sana Malik from the regional passport office in Secunderabad by submission of false documents such as residence proof, educational certificates, etc. This passport was used by her to travel to Portugal and Lisbon. Monica Bedi was convicted under Section 256 of IPC of Lisbon and served a part of her sentence. When she came back to India, trial was commenced against her under sections 419, 420 and 120B of IPC for the above mentioned offence. The issue dealt in this case was whether the convict entitled to the protection under Article 20 Clause 2 of the Constitution as well as Section 300 of the CRPC. The court in this case held that if the offences are distinct, there can be no ban on second prosecution. Here, Monica Bedi was convicted in Lisbon under Section 265 of IPC of Lisbon. And here under India, she has been convicted under Sections 419, 420 and 120B of IPC. Though one of her act, her single act amounted to different offences, the ingredients of the offences are the law of Lisbon is totally different from the law of India. Article 20 Clause 2 bars double jeopardy within the Indian jurisdiction. Here, one cannot claim a foreign trial and foreign punishment to be the first trial and punishment and the subsequent trial in India to be double jeopardy, right? So, though the same set of facts is giving rise to two distinct offences and therefore the ban of Article 20 Clause 2 of the Constitution and Section 300 of CRPC is not applicable, right? So, here the court held that the trial and proceedings punishment under the Lisbon Act cannot be considered as the first trial, and on the basis of that she cannot claim the bar of the trial under sections 419, 20 and 120B by showing Article 20 Clause 2. This is how 20 Clause 2 to be interpreted. Now coming to Article 20 Clause 3. Article 20 Clause 3 provides protection against self-incrimination. 20 Clause 3 reads that no person accused of an offence shall be compelled to be a witness against himself. This clause is based on the maxim nemo tenetur prodire accusere sipsum, which means no man is bound to accuse himself. The language of Article 20 Clause 3 resembles the Fifth Amendment of the American Constitution, which lays down that no person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. The English common law principle, no man is bound to accuse himself, was interpreted as right. In US and UK, it is a privilege against self-incrimination. I am again repeating, please underline the word privilege against self-incrimination. Principle against self-incrimination. Principle against self-incrimination was the term coined by David M. Pesiosi, and this became famous rather than privilege against self-incrimination. According to jurists, this word privilege against self-incrimination is viewed in such a way that to speak of the privilege against self-incrimination degrades it inadvertently in comparison to other constitutional rights. Now coming to the Article 14 Clause 3 of the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights 1966, which enunciates that in the determination of any criminal charge against him, everyone shall be entitled not to be compelled to testify against himself or to confess guilt. The privilege against self-incrimination was developed due to reaction of the extensive employment of the oath. Hence, the principle was established in the common law as a revolt against procedure in which accused was questioned under oath by judges, both to get evidence and to get confession. The doctrine of immunity from self-incrimination is founded on the presumption of innocence, which characterizes the English system of criminal justice as against inquisitorial system, known to its ancient law and at present prevailing in France and some other continental countries. Now coming to the Indian scenario, in India the status is as follows: that the accused is presumed to be innocent, that it is for the prosecution to establish his guilt, that the accused need not to make any statement against his will. This protection has been guaranteed on the assumption that if compulsory examination of an accused were to be permitted, may lead to force and torture. It enables the maintenance of human privacy and observance of civilized standards in the enforcement of criminal justice. The protection contained in Article 20, Clause 3 is available to every person. The term person in Article 20, Clause 3 includes not only the natural individuals but also the companies and unincorporated bodies. The protection is available only if the following ingredients are present. First, it is a right available to a person accused of an offence only. So, to avail this right, the person who is demanding for protection under Article 20, Clause 3 shall be a person accused of an offence. Second, it is a protection against compulsion to be a witness. Such person who is accused of an offence should have been compelled to be a witness. Witness of what? That compulsion should result into giving evidence against himself. That is the third point. So, the person should have been accused of an offence and should have been compelled to be a witness against himself. When all the three ingredients are present, then in a particular case, then only the court can guarantee Article 20 Clause 20 Clause 3 to that person. Now coming to the person accused of an offence. The first ingredient. A person accused of an offence means a person against whom a formal accusation relating to the commission of an offence has been levied, which in normal course may result in a prosecution. Accused of an offence would indicate that the proceedings therein contemplated are of the nature of criminal proceedings before a court of law or a judicial tribunal, and the prosecution in this context would mean an initiation or starting of proceedings of a criminal nature before a court of law or a judicial tribunal in accordance with the procedure prescribed in the statute which creates the offence and regulates procedure. So we can say that in simple way, that whatever the interpretation was given to the words proceedings as well as the prosecution in Article 20 Clause 1 and 20 Clause 2, the same will be applied here also for 20 Clause 3. The words accused of any offence indicates an accusation made in a criminal prosecution before the court or a judicial tribunal, where a person is charged with having committed an act which is punishable under IPC 1860 or any special or local criminal law. The word accused of any offence makes it clear that the privilege under the Indian Constitution is confined to an accused in a criminal proceedings and does not apply to civil proceedings. Like Article 20 Clause 1 and 20 Clause 2, even 20 Clause 3 is also applicable only against the criminal proceedings but not under the civil proceedings. For invoking constitutional right against testimonial compulsion guaranteed under Article 20 Clause 3, it must appear that a formal accusation has been made against the party pleading the guarantee and that it relates to the commission of an offence which in the normal course may result in prosecution. Now coming to the second ingredient under Article 20 Clause 3, protection against compulsion to be a witness. Article 20 Clause 3 provides the protection against compulsion of the accused to be a witness against himself, which can also be said to be a protection against testimonial compulsion. Now coming to the interpretation of the types of incriminating evidences which can be covered under 20 Clause 3. As I said, it can be Article 20 Clause 3, that is the protection against compulsion to be a witness against himself, can also be said to be a protection against testimonial compulsion. That means it covers oral testimony as well as something beyond that. A person can be a witness not merely by giving oral evidence but also by producing documents or making intelligible gestures, as in the case of a dumb witness. Hence, not only the testimonial evidence, testimonial compulsion, but also something beyond that. That means compelling a person to produce any document or something can also be covered under Article 20 Clause 3. Now coming to the interpretation, in MP Sharma versus Satish Chandra, the Supreme Court gave a wide connotation to the term to be a witness so as to include oral, documentary and testimonial evidence. In this case, the court held that protection contained in 20 Clause 3 covered not only testimonial compulsion in the courtroom but also compelled testimony previously obtained from him. The court in this case held that it would extend to any compulsory process for production of evidentiary documents which is reasonably likely to support prosecution against the accused. The proposition laid down in MP Sharma case was narrowed down in State of Bombay versus Katti Kallu Ogad. This is a very important case. In this case, 5 issues were dealt. First issue is whether a direction given by a court to an person accused present in court to give his specimen writing and signature for the purpose of comparison under provisions of Section 73 Evidence Act violates Article 20 Clause 3. Second, whether by production of specimen handwriting of the accused, he could be said to have been a witness against himself within the ambit of Article 20 Clause 3. Third, whether the mere fact that the accused was in police custody when specimen handwriting had been given could by itself amount to a compulsion apart from the elements vitiating the consent of the accused. Fourth, whether the impressions of the accused's palms and fingers taken from him after his arrest, which were compared with the impressions on the glass panes and fields, were not admissible in view of Article 20 Clause 3. Fifth one is whether Section 5 and 6 of Identifications of Prisoners Act 1920 violated Article 20 Clause 3. In this case, the court held that the self-incrimination must mean conveying information based upon the personal knowledge of the person giving information and covers only personal testimony which must depend on his choice. This cannot include merely the mechanical process of producing documents in court, which may throw a light on any of the points in the controversy, but which do not contain any statement of the accused based on his personal knowledge. For example, the accused person may be in possession of a document which is in his writing or which contains his signatures or his thumb impressions. Production of such a document with a view to comparison of the writing or the signature or the impression is not the statement of an accused person which can be said to be of the nature of a personal testimony. Right? For example, in court, if the accused person was asked to sign before the court, that does not amount to self-incrimination. In this case, the majority judgment held that the voluntary statements were admissible in evidence. First point, any information obtained during investigation of a crime by police, if an accused person were to point out the place where the corpus delicti was lying concealed, and in pursuance of such information the discovery was made under Section 27 of the Evidence Act, such evidence can be proved and is not hit by Article 20 Clause 3. That is, if suppose a person told that a knife which was used to murder a person is thrown in a particular place, the police goes over there and finds that knife, right? So such evidence can be proved and is not hit by Article 20 Clause 3. Here, the information which was obtained by the police from the accused is proved and the article is recovered from that particular place, right? So such sort of information which is obtained by the police during the investigation and where such information yields some evidence, such evidences cannot be considered to be obtained under compulsion. Now coming to the case, State of Gujarat versus Shyamlal Mohanlal Choksi. It's a very interesting case. In this case, the respondent, a money lender, was prosecuted under the Money Lenders Act for not keeping proper accounts. The prosecutor applied to the magistrate to direct the accused to produce the accounts. Mr. Choksi argued that such direction of the court is against the right guaranteed to him under Article 20, Clause 3, and he pleaded for taking back the direction. The court refused to do so. Aggrieved by the court refusal, Mr. Choksi filed a writ petition for enforcement of his right against self-incrimination. Now coming to Section 94, Clause 1 of CRPC. Here you can see, whenever any court or in any place beyond the limits of the towns of Calcutta and Bombay, any officer in charge of a police station considers that the production of any document or other thing is necessary or desirable for the purpose of any investigation, inquiry, trial or other proceedings under this code, by or before such a court or officer, such court may issue a summons or such officer a written order to the person in whose possession or power such document or thing is believed to be, requiring him to attend and produce it or to produce it at the time and place stated in the summons or orders. Now the question is about the application of Section 94 vis-a-vis Article 20, Clause 3. While looking into the provisions, the court held that failure to comply with an order under Section 94 may expose a person to penal action under Section 485 of the Code, and he may be prosecuted under Section 175 of the IPC. That means here the court may take penal action under Section 485 of the Code if the person whom the court directed to produce the document is not produced, and when the police in charge is demanding for a document and when he is not being given such document or supported in the investigation by giving such document, then the police may proceed against that person under Section 175 of IPC. So 94 violation of Section 94 by any person would amount to two offences, one under Section 175 of IPC, the second under Section 485 of the Code. Court is empowered to impose penal action against, initiate penal action against the person. Here you can see I underlined the words to attend and produce. The accused person is already under the jurisdiction of the court. That means he is under the custody of the court. So the words attend and produce gives a wider interpretation to Section 94 Clause 1, which includes any person, not only the person who is accused in the proceedings, but also any other person whom the police officer or the court believed to be possessing the required documents, right? So Supreme Court in this case held that under Section 94, if the order issued by the court or police officer summons a person who is accused before the court to produce documents or things, then he is compelled to be a witness against himself. If such summons are issued by the court or the police officer to other persons other than the accused, then that would not attract 20 Clause 3. First, they tried to divide the persons who are simply possessing the documents. Second, the person who is accused of the offense and possessing the documents. In the first instance, when dealing with the persons who are not the accused but possesses the document, they cannot avail Article 20 Clause 3 protection. Now coming to the second category, if such order has been issued against an accused person, then the other ingredient which the person had to prove under Article 20 Clause 3 is that he has been compelled to be a witness against himself. Compulsion is required to be proved. Hence, here when mandatory direction is given by the court for production of such documents, whether it amounts to compulsion or not is the question. Here the court held that the protection against guaranteed under Article 20 Clause 3 against Section 94 of CRPC is limited to the testimonial compulsion vis-a-vis proceedings in court, right? So the court in this case held that giving a mandatory direction under section 94 of CRPC to an accused person to produce documents will amount to compulsion, and such directions will attract Article 20 Clause 3. Though in this case the court did not deliver that section 94 CRPC is unconstitutional when applied against the accused person. Hence, in this case, we can say that protection guaranteed under 20 Clause 3 against section 94 of CRPC is limited to the person accused when compelled to give testimonial evidence in the court proceedings. Now coming to R.M. Malkhani versus State of Maharashtra. In this case, the prosecution produced a tape recorded evidence. Admissibility of such tape recorded evidence was challenged by the petitioner to be violative of Article 20 Clause 3. According to him, when the tape recorder was recorded without his knowledge, he is ignorant about such recording. That's why, hence, he could not choose his words cautiously. Right. The court in this case held that recording of the conversation on tape is a mechanical contrivance to play the role of eavesdropper, and the argument that the accused is ignorant of recording do not amount to duress or compulsion. The tape recorded statement becomes admissible if the conversation is relevant to the matter at issue, the voice is clearly identified, and the accuracy of the tape recorded conversion is proved by eliminating the possibility of erasing the tape recorded conversation, and is also proved by eliminating the possibility. A contemporaneous tape record of a relevant conversation is relevant fact and is admissible under section 8 of the Indian Evidence Act. This is how, in this case, the court held that the tape recorded evidences are admissible and are not covered under Article 20 Clause 3, even though that such tape recording is done without the knowledge of the accused. Now comes an interesting question, Selvi versus State of Karnataka, that is whether brain mapping, narco-analysis and lie detector test etc. amount to violation of Article 20 Clause 3. You can see that lie detector test, narco-analysis, all these things are conducted in different cases, like Ayushi Talwar case. Fine. Then there's one more case, Tiwari case. The apex court in Selvi versus State of Karnataka held that compulsory conduction of such tests violates Article 20 Clause 3. Hence, court held that the accused shall be informed and his consent is to be obtained before conduction of these tests. So, his consent shall not be obtained under compulsion, there shall not be leading or influencing questions, and the entire process to be recorded for court purposes. However, the court in this case held that those evidences cannot be considered as conclusive evidences and they are rebuttable in nature. Suppose if a person refuses to undergo these tests, the court, such refusal is to be accepted, otherwise that would amount to compulsion. Now comes the interpretation of the term compulsion. An accused person cannot be said to have been compelled to be a witness against himself simply because he made a statement while in police custody without anything more. The Fifth Amendment of the US Constitution prohibits compelling a person to speak and incriminate himself, but it does not prohibit compelled revelation of written thoughts. The mere questioning of an accused person by a police officer resulting in a voluntary statement which may ultimately turn out to be incriminatory is not compulsion. So, compulsion here in this context shall be duress. That is, if the police officer obtains statement by using a third degree method or by creating mental stress or pressure, then that would amount to compulsion. If a person in custody is to be subjected to interrogation, he must first be informed in clear and unequivocal terms that he has the right to remain silent. He had to be made aware of the constitutional rights guaranteed to him under Article 20, Article 21 as well as Article 22. The compulsion is in this sense is a physical objective act and not the state of mind of the person making the statement, except where mind has been so conditioned by some extraneous process as to render the making of the statement involuntary and therefore extorted. So here, if you are molding or hypnotizing a person and taking out the statement, that would amount to compulsion, right? So if the mind is conditioned by some extraneous process as to render the making of the statement involuntary, then it can be called as compulsion. Here, to be a witness is not equivalent to furnishing evidence in its widest significance, that is to say, as including not merely making of oral or written statement but also production of documents or giving materials which may be relevant at a trial to determine the guilt or innocence of the accused. So, self incrimination here under Article 20, Clause 3 only means conveying information based upon personal knowledge of the person giving information without any compulsion. Therefore, where an accused is compelled to produce a document in his possession which is not based on personal knowledge of the accused, there is no violation of Article 20, Clause 3 because he does not become a witness by the mere fact that he has produced it. It is a production of document is not considered to be a revelation of the information based upon his personal knowledge. Okay. The immunity does not extend to civil proceedings, as I already explained, it amounts to criminal proceedings only. Hence, Supreme Court in plethora of cases held that to claim immunity under Article 20 Clause 3, accused shall be compelled to make the self-incriminating statement. It must appear that a formal accusation has been made against the person at the time when he is asked, that is, FIR should have been lodged or complaint should have been lodged, to make the incriminating statement. If suppose if a person has been called just for the inquiry sake, where he has not been, there is no FIR lodged against him or complaint lodged against him, then such person cannot claim immunity under 20 clause 3 even though he has been compelled to speak, right? So only when a formal accusation has been made against the person at the time when he has been asked to make the incriminating statement, then only he can claim protection under Article 20 Clause 3. There is a constitutional bar against compulsion but not against voluntary offer. If a person is offering voluntarily to speak before the investigating officer, that does not amount to violation of Article 20 Clause 3. Now coming to right to remain silent. In Re B.N. Ramakrishna case, the court, while dealing with the question whether Section 313 Clause 2 of CRPC is repugnant to Article 220 Clause 3, held that the answers given by the accused under Section 313 Clause 2 of CRPC would not offend Article 20 Clause 3 for two reasons. It is a matter of option to the accused to answer or not when he is questioned, and no oath is administered to him as to witness, and his testimony cannot be put in evidence in the trial or inquiry. Hence, there is no oath, there is no compulsion. He has an option either to answer or not to answer. That's why Section 313 Clause 2 is not offended by Article 20 Clause 3. Now coming to the second reason. Judge can draw inferences from refusal but does not mean compelling an accused to be a witness against himself. So when judge is drawing inferences from the silence of the accused or the refusal of the accused to answer the questions, that would not amount to compulsion to be a witness against himself. Judge can draw inferences. You may not say that I am forced to speak because judge can draw negative inferences against my refusal to speak, right? According to the Apex Code in this case, there is no express right to silence guaranteed under Constitution, but it is implied in nature by the interpretation of Article 19 Clause 1 Subclause A read with Article 20 Clause 3 and 21. When a police officer during investigation examines any person under Section 161 CRPC, that person is bound to answer truly all questions put to him other than those questions which are incriminatory in nature. For example, if a police officer asks, what is your name? You should answer because it's a basic question. Fine. So you are bound to answer truly to all the questions which are general in nature and you can seek protection against only those questions which are incriminatory in nature. If suppose he asks the question that whether you are the one who murdered Mr. A, then it is an incriminating question. What is your name is not an incriminating question. Hence, the court held that to balance section 161 and right to remain silent under guaranteed under article protected under article 19 clause 1 subclause a read with article 20 clause 3 as well as 21, when the court had to differentiate between the normal questions and the incriminating questions, and only the incriminating questions, if involves the element of compulsion and and compulsion, then only such questions can be considered as violation of article 20 clause 3. Now coming to the another important case, Nandini Satpathy versus PL Dhani. In the facts of the case are as follows. Nandini was directed to appear at the police station for being examined in connection with a case registered against her under the Prevention of Corruption Act. You can see here the case was registered against her. There is a formal registration of case against her. So she is accused person. On the basis of FIR, investigation was commenced against her and she was interrogated by the police for long. But she refused to give answers by claiming Article 20 clause. Subsequently, she approached the court for protection under 20 clause 3, stating that she has been compelled during the interrogation or investigation. Justice Krishna Iyer in this case opined that Article 20 clause 3 ought to extend to police investigation also, since inquiries under criminal status with quasi-criminal investigations are often accusatory in nature and are sure to end in prosecution if the offence is grave and the evidence gathered is good. Justice Krishna Iyer attempted to give a wider interpretation to Article 20 clause 3 compared to the previous case in Re B.N. Ramakrishna. In Re B.N. Ramakrishna, what we discussed, we tried to categorize the questions into two groups. One, which are very basic questions which are not incriminatory in nature. The second one is the incriminatory questions. If the questions are incriminatory in nature, then only Article 20 clause 3 will be applied. And when the questions are non-incriminatory, then Article 20 clause 3 will not be applied. But Krishna Iyer in this case opined that police investigations normally are accusatory in nature. Hence, there shall be and when the cases which come before the court under Article 20 clause 3 involves an offence which is grave and the evidence gathered is good, then guaranteeing protection under 20 clause 3 is required. Here the court observed that it extends to any compulsory process for production of evidentiary documents which are reasonably likely to support the production against accused. So, in Nandini Satpathy case, while holding that accused is entitled to be silent if the answer sought has a reasonable prospect of exposing him to guilt in some other accusation, actual or imminent, then Article 20 clause 3 to be extended to such cases also. So it's a wider interpretation given to Article 20 clause 3 in Nandini Satpathy. And again the court held that 20 clause 3 is not applicable to civil proceedings and administrative proceedings, and even the administrative investigations are also not covered under 20 clause 3. But if it is a criminal proceeding and there is a formal accusation, accused is entitled to be silent if the answer sought has a reasonable prospect of exposing him to guilt, not only in this complaint but also may lead to some other accusation and to some other crime. Hence, the court in this case held that Article 20 clause 3 is to be given a wider interpretation. Now coming to K. Joseph Agasti versus Narayan. The facts of the case are as follows. According to Section 45G of the Banking Companies Act, after an order for the winding up of a banking company has been made, the official liquidator has to submit a report whether in his opinion any loss has been caused to the company by any act or omission of the directors amounting to fraud. After considering the report, the High Court may publicly examine the directors, promoters, auditors, etc. Mr. Agasti, being ordered by court to appear for examination under Section 45G, challenged the constitutionality of Section 45G against Article 20, Clause 3. Supreme Court in this case held that under this section, a person could be compelled to answer incriminating questions. Subsequently, even charges might be levied against the directors. Nevertheless, the privilege under 20 Clause 3 would not apply as there was no formal accusation against the directors at that stage. The object of Section 4, see, the only issue is though there is no formal accusation at the stage of the examination under Section 45G, but that may lead to institution of formal accusation at a later stage. The object of Section 45G is to collect evidence and decide whether any acts or omissions have caused loss to the company. Here, the accusation may or may not follow the inquiry, but there is no accusation at the time of the inquiry. But considering the future possibility of accusation, here the court applied Article 20, Clause 3 and held that even if a person against whom the formal accusation has not been made has been put to an inquiry which may lead to a future formal accusation, such instances are also covered under Article 20, Clause 3. You can see that slowly the court is trying to adopt a wider interpretation compared to In re B.N. Ramakrishna case as well as the other cases. Now coming to the last case, Raja Narayan Lal Bansilal versus Manek Firoz Mistry. Here, Section 137, Clause 5 of the Companies Act 1913 was involved. The registrar in his report to the government alleged that the business of the company was being carried on in fraud of the contributories. The government under Section 137, Clause 5 of the Companies Act can appoint the inspector to investigate. The inspector issued notices for being examined on oath under Section 239 and 240 of the Companies Act 1956. The examination is on oath. Fine. So hence what happened that appellants immediately claimed Article 20 Clause 3 stating that they have been compelled to produce the documents. They have been compelled to take oath to respond to the examinations. Hence their right against self-incrimination is violated. The court here said the proceedings under the Companies Act cannot be called as a judicial proceedings and there is no formal accusation, that is FIR has been lodged. Hence, the privilege guaranteed under 20 Clause 3 cannot be applied. So to conclude, to apply Article 20 Clause 3, first he should be an accused, that is where against him a formal accusation has already been made. That should be a criminal proceeding. The questions should be incriminatory in nature and he should have been compelled to answer those questions. If all these three ingredients are covered, Article 20 Clause 3 can be guaranteed. Thank you.